Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. In the fog-heavy January of 1392, Chateau de China loomed quietly over the River Vienne in the Loire Valley, its aging towers exhaling clouds of frost with every gust of wind. It was a season of hard ground, slow mornings, and the echo of boots against stone beneath its noble tapestries and vaulted ceilings. The castle's courtyards and corridors were reduced to frigid passageways where breath lingered in the air and cold seeped up through the soles of shoes. If you were among the servants waking just before dawn, you'd tug your wool cloak tighter and grope your way toward the castle's more regrettable to skimping the chamber pots. But what if they had frozen solid? The chateau was built for defense, not comfort. Drafty windows, unheated towers, and privies that emptied directly into open moats or cesspits were the norm. The noble classes, despite their wealth, found themselves at war with the seasons each winter. And no season declared its supremacy quite like January. At Chinon, stone privies projected from the side of towers, perched like architectural afterthoughts. These garderobes, as they were called, were more about status than sanitation, while peasants in nearby villages braved pit toilets in huts or squatted in forests. Nobles enjoyed the distinction of sitting upon a wooden bench carved over a vertical shaft, waist dropped down into a chute or open air. But in winter, that vertical shaft could freeze like a chimney pipe. And in Chinon, positioned on high rock, with its north-facing garderobes fully exposed, the cold could be so severe that excrement would harden mid-fall. On certain icy mornings, the waste didn't even leave the bench. Urine turned to slush. Solid waste clung to the timber. The stone seats of the garderobes, already a challenge on warm days, became glacial instruments of discomfort. It wasn't just undignified, it was dangerous. Prolonged exposure to freezing surfaces could lead to frostbite. And though they rarely spoke of it aloud, noblemen and noblewomen alike dreaded those first waking moments when nature's call met nature's chill. Some nobles, such as Jean de Berry, known for his luxurious tastes and chronic discomfort, attempted to innovate. The personal chambers of Chateau de Chinon were sometimes stocked with padded linen seats that could be set atop the frigid bench. Lined with fur or thick woven cloth, these layers provided minor relief, but not enough. In wealthier homes, servants were ordered to pre-warm the garderobe with coals or hot bricks. Yet this posed a dangerous risk. There were several documented fires throughout French castles due to embers placed too close to dry wood or linen. More commonly, nobles simply avoided the problem altogether. Instead of braving the freezing tower shaft, they made use of close stools, portable boxes with a seat, and a removable chamber pot beneath. These were often lined with cloth and carried discreetly by valets or maids, especially at night. In noble households like Chinon, chamber pots were frequently crafted of pewter, bronze, or even glazed ceramics, though the cold still found its way through these materials. By morning, the contents might be frozen stiff, forming a curious alchemy of bodily function and medieval climate. For chambermaids, this created yet another challenge. The contents were frozen, they could not be poured out. Chamber pots had to be upturned and smacked, sometimes with a wooden mallet, until the icy mass broke free. One servant, in a 15th century record from a nearby estate, wrote of chipping out its frozen urine cakes with a small Nifa task that was neither pleasant nor efficient. Chinon was particularly vulnerable because of its location. Built atop a windy promontory above the river, its towers acted as wind funnels, Rooms situated along the outer walls, though offering a view, were frigid through and through. Stone retains cold-like memory, enduring especially long cold spells. Even beds beside large hearths couldn't provide full reprieve. The nobles themselves wore heavy underlayers, woolen hose, linen undershirts, and sometimes even double-wrapped garments at night. But these layers had to be peeled away to use the chamber pot, often requiring the assistance of a valet or maid. 14th century, noble woman might have needed up to 4 layers removed just to relieve herself. The indignity of exposure, coupled with the ambient chill, meant that nighttime calls of nature were often delayed until morning, and still, there was no escaping it entirely. If you lived at Chinon in winter, you likely heard the complaints: chronic constipation from avoiding chamber pot use, frostbitten thighs from misjudging the temperature of a garderobe seat, complaints about the need to urinate at all after sipping warm ale to stay cozy at night. Chamber pot mishaps were rarely discussed in courtly poetry, but they were part of daily life nonetheless. It was not uncommon for nobles to improvise. In one winter record from Chinon Steward, an unusual request is logged: a velvet seat cover for the Lady Isabel's portable throne. Velvet was a rare luxury for such purposes, but her lord husband had allowed the expense after she suffered a nasty red rash from sitting on cold metal during a midnight visit to the chamber stool. The cover, however, had to be changed daily. Absorption and odor were issues of their own. There's also some speculation that certain servants developed specialized tools for breaking: frozen waist-curved scrapers, long iron tongs, and what one 15th century inventory dryly described as a slotted lance. Whether this was truly a tool for chamber pots or just a misnamed fireplace implement remains a matter of minor academic debate. Yet, perhaps, the most revealing details lie not in what was invented to solve the issue, but in what was not. For all their wealth, the nobles of Chateau de Chinon, indeed, throughout medieval France, seemed resigned to their fate. No elaborate heating system was installed for the garderobes. No formal regulations were written to instruct servants on the disposal of frozen waste. It was simply endured. Like so many other miseries of winter, the frozen chamber pot was a metaphor for medieval nobility's unique kind of helplessness, surrounded by wealth, but powerless against cold. And so, each morning at Chinon began not with the ringing of bells or the rustling of gowns, but with the soft knock of a chambermaid's knuckle announcing her entry. Her hands red from frost, her eyes still bleary. She would bend to her first and most unglamorous duty, lifting a heavy, frozen pot and beginning the day with a quiet war against last night's bodily truth. It was, in every way, a deeply human reminder of how even the highest towers couldn't keep out the ice. But one year, 1401, if we believe the old Stuart's Lejour, particularly harsh winter pushed the castle to the brink. Chamber pots were no longer just freezing, they were exploding, and that's where the real trouble began. The year 1401 was unkind to nearly every soul within the walls of Chateau de Chinon. A bitter wind had settled over the Loire Valley in early November and refused to leave. By January, the well-worn stone floors of the castle felt like frozen riverbeds. The tapestries lining the halls hung stiff with moisture. Windows, few and narrow as they were, cracked in their frames. Yet, the true misery for nobles and servants alike was what happened behind closed doors, specifically the doors that led to the garderobes and bedchambers. That winter became infamous in the Stuarts' books, not for war, nor famine, but for what it did to waste. Freezing had always been a nuisance, but this year, temperatures dropped so far below what even the seasoned chambermaids expected that chamber pots were turning into traps. Pewter pots bulged, glazed, ceramic cracked, and in at least 2 separate incidents documented in the housekeeper's account, The contents of frozen pots expanded with such force that the vessels ruptured, one during removal and one during the night while still under the bed of a baron. The latter incident was never discussed in polite company, but a few muttered references in the laundry inventory suggest that the baron's feather mattress, wool underblanket, and 2 layers of linen bedding had to be discarded entirely, and the chambermaid responsible for morning service that day, her name was Colette, was transferred to kitchen duty by the end of the week. The implication was clear. It wasn't her fault, but someone had to answer for the mess. To understand how such explosions occurred, one must recall the construction of medieval chamber pots. They weren't sealed. There was no lid or release valve, but they were durable, heavy, and often overfilled. When liquid waste froze overnight, it expanded outward, pressing against the walls of the container with slow, steady pressure. In metal vessels, this sometimes resulted in warping. In ceramic ones, especially those made of low-fired earthenware, the pot could crack violently under the strain. A sudden fracture meant waste could leak, shatter, or, in rare cases, burst. It wasn't a dramatic explosion like one might imagine with fireworks. It was loud enough to wake the sleeper beside it. The sound of pewter splitting in cold silence, followed by a slop of contents on 2 rust-strewn floors. It was not the kind of thing a noblewoman wanted to explain to her maid or her husband. This led to a new winter fear. Bedchamber inspections. Household servants were ordered to inspect pots, not only for fullness, but for signs of strain. If the rim bulged or the base bowed outward, the pot was to be emptied immediately. If frozen, this led to an entirely new early morning thawing, whereby pots were set near hearths to slowly loosen their contents. However, this too had its dangers. One particularly careless scullion placed a frozen ceramic pot too close to a roaring kitchen fire. The pot cracked. A foul stench filled the room. The scullion was beaten, not for the accident, but for delaying the midday meal. In response, the castle's steward issued an order that chamber pots be placed in iron holders beside the hearth, not on the stones directly. This helped reduce incidents, but not enough to curb rising tension. As the frost deepened, the chamber pot became a source of paranoia. Nobles began requesting double-service 2 pots per bedchamber to alternate between nights. Some requested smaller evening pots intended only for urine, hoping they'd freeze less aggressively. A particularly paranoid viscount had his pots lined with sheep's wool, an unwise move, as it absorbed waste and froze faster than expected. It had to be cut out the next morning with shears in response to these peculiar demands. The castle's steward recorded a particularly telling line in his January 1401 log. The nobility are at war with their own excrement. By early February, rumors swirled of a new warming technique, borrowed from a visiting merchant from Milan, keeping chamber pots beneath a bed warming pan filled with coals. But while this worked for bed sheets, it was an untested idea for waste storage. One laddie in waiting gave it a try. The result was a minor fire, an acrid smell that lingered for days, and the total destruction of a woolen bed canopy worth more than a servant's yearly wage. It became clear that no solution could outmatch the cold, and so the nobles did what nobles do. They delegated. Servants, already burdened with tending fires, fetching water, and managing food, now found themselves carrying warm bricks to be placed beside chamber pots at dusk. These bricks, however, lost heat quickly. One had to be swapped every few hours to be effective. Most servants simply placed a warm brick during evening turn-down service and hoped. No one noticed the pot was cold by midnight, but some nobles were more observant than others. The Baroness of Valenque, then wintering at Chinon, was known for her early morning temper. On February 10th, she reportedly screamed at her maid after sitting on a pot so cold she felt it burn. The maid, Madeline, was only 16 and swore she placed a warming brick as instructed. The steward's records offered no outcome, but the following entry notes: the purchase of fur-lined privy covers, an item rarely seen in castle inventories until that point. By mid-February, Keenan had become a fortress not against war, but against waste. Privy servants were rotated more frequently due to burnout. Those assigned to chamber pot duty, typically younger boys or girls from peasant families, found themselves soaked in brine and vinegar twice daily, trying to chip away at the crusted edges of frozen excrement. The smell of warming pots became so pervasive that one courtier joked that Chinnen now smelled like a latrine with a drawbridge. And yet, there was an eerie equality to it all. No amount of gold or heraldry could prevent your chamber pot from freezing. Nobles might order more servants, or request fancier pots, or layer their nightclothes in triple wool sput in the deep hours of night. When nature called and the stone walls groaned with cold, they too sat, shivered, and hoped their pot would not betray them. Still, an uneasy silence settled over the halls, a sense of collective fatigue. It had become too much, too frequent, too absurd. And so, late in the season, as March approached and no thaw had yet come, the castle steward convened what was later jokingly referred to as the Cold Privy Council, a small gathering of nobles and senior servants drawn together, not for politics or battle preparations, but to discuss the future of waste management. For several hours, they discussed solutions. Should chamber pots be insulated with straw? Could hot ash be sprinkled atop waste each night? Could servants empty pots more frequently every 2 hours? Should new garderobes be constructed facing east for more sun? Ultimately, few ideas gained traction, but one compromise emerged shared: a central warming chamber for pots. An unused wine cellar near the castle's kitchens was cleared out. A small hearth was lit within. Each morning, frozen pots were brought there to thaw. The smell was awful, but the process worked for the remainder of winter. This became known as the thaw room. It required extra labor, but accidents dwindled. Pots stopped exploding. Nobles stopped screaming. And for a brief time, even the lowliest potboy was seen with a little more respect. Still, no one forgot that winter, the year the pots exploded. The frostbite, the smell, the furious baron, the privy seat that burned like ice. And yet, as the first snowmelt arrived in April, Chinnen's nobles returned to their usual rhythms: feasting, hunting, scheming. The chamber pots still needed emptying. The panic faded, folded into the long ledger of castle history. Only the steward's journal remembered. One final note, inked in careful hand: there is no dignity in winter, only delay. Even lords must learn the patience of thaw. But if the thaw didn't come soon enough, what else might have frozen solid? The thaw, when it finally came, did not arrive with fanfare. There was no single day when the icicles vanished, no trumpet blast from the chapel tower to mark the return of warmth. It arrived in fits and starts: meltwater trickling from eaves, the slow disappearance of frost from the corners of casement windows, and the damp, heavy smell of the earth reawakening beneath the packed snow. But for the residents of Chateau de Chinon town, the most visible sign of the thaw came from the sudden silence in the cellar. The thaw room, once echoing with the scrape of pots and the grumbles of overworked privy boys, grew still. Fewer pots arrived each morning. Fires burned lower. The unmistakable stench of slow-thawed human waste began to fade, absorbed once again by layers of straw or washed away in the gutters. And with that fading came a peculiar realization: the crisis had ended. The panic, the paranoia, the unrelenting schedule of inspection and thawing and warming it had all been temporary. And yet, it left behind a peculiar kind of scar for many, especially those whose status afforded them distance from the practical horrors of the ordeal. The experience passed into the realm of memory almost immediately. The Baron, who had ordered 3 new pots, hand-painted and lined with pewter, never used them again. They were placed in a storage room, along with other failed winter contraptions, fur-lined seat covers, stalked lids, and an elaborate wooden warming box that never once worked. But the servants remembered. They remembered the cracked skin on their hands from hot ash and vinegar scrubbing, the bruises from hauling buckets up frozen stairs, the burns from foolishly placing frozen pots too close to open flame, and perhaps most of all, Kay remembered the silence from the upper chambers, the long stretches where nobles, cloistered in thick robes, never acknowledged that anything was amiss beyond the fact that the air smells worse this winter. For the lowest staff, winter wasn't just a season, it was a reckoning. By the end of that March, a quarter of the castle's privy staff had left, returned to farms. Others joined monastic kitchens, where waste duties were more systematically managed. One boy, Henry, age 12, was recorded as running away entirely. His last seen walking toward tours with a bread heel in one hand and a cracked pot lid in the other. He was never mentioned again in the castle logs, but his absence lingered in a way no servant wanted to be reassigned to thaw duty. Interestingly, in the quieter weeks of April, a few of the noble residents began reflecting, awkwardly, on their experiences. One lady, the Countess of Sancerre, penned a letter to her sister in Paris, describing the winter as a season of humility, noting that even the wealthiest had become beholden to nature's deeper whims. It is the only known reference among the nobility that acknowledged the absurdity of their shared ordeal. Yet, that tone of humility was rare. The majority of nobles treated the episode as a minor convenience and chapter to be quietly forgotten, like a poor harvest or an embarrassing cough at court. And this, perhaps, revealed something far more enduring than the chamber pots themselves. For in a world governed by hierarchy, where distance from the unpleasant was the very definition of status, the freezing of waste was a brutal equalizer. Yes, the nobles had more servants. Yes, they had better pots, thicker robes, extra warming bricks. But when the temperatures plunged low enough, and the chamber pot froze to the floor beneath the bed, cracked open in the still of night, no title or coin could prevent the sting of humiliation. For once, they were not exempt. They, too, had to face the grotesque mechanics of their own survival. This realization, while quietly acknowledged in brief moments, perhaps in a hasty glance or a muttered complaint, was quickly buried beneath the trappings of springtime. The hunts resumed. The musicians returned to the halls. Tapestries were aired, linens re-dyed, and chambermaids reassigned to more palatable tasks. But the stewards took note. In the summer of 1401, curious procurement order appeared in the records of Chateau de Chinon, a request for long-handled urinals and wall-fixed privy flasks lined with tin to be installed near hearths and guest chambers. It was an odd combination of comfort and practicality, and it suggests that, while the nobles had forgotten, castle's logistics staff had not. They were preparing, quietly, patiently, for next time, because the lessons of winter, once learned by those who bear the burden of others' comfort, never truly unlearned. Meanwhile, back in the cellars, the thaw room remained empty now, save for the scent of ash in the walls and a few warped pot holders stacked in the corner. One servant was heard referring to it as the last room of truth in the whole castle. For in that dark, low-ceilinged chamber beneath, flickering torchlight, the great illusion of nobility had cracked like a ceramic chamber pot left too long on a frozen floor, and as the seasons turned and vines crept over the outer walls of Chinon, the rhythm of life resumed its ancient pattern. Visitors came and went, ambassadors dined beneath glittering chandeliers, and when nature called, they still used chamber pot to emptied, cleaned, and replaced by hands they never saw. But somewhere in the minds of those hands lived the memory of a winter that would not break. And the nobles who, for just a moment, were forced to face what they had always left behind. The winter of 1442 swept through the Scottish Highlands with a kind of ferocity that emptied forests of birds and kept even the hardiest sheep huddled against stone walls. In Stirling Keep, a fortress perched atop volcanic rock and long considered one of the crown's prized northern outposts, life that season became a strange ritual of endurance and quiet humiliation. Stirling was no stranger to cold. The castle's walls were thick, its hearths broad, and its kitchens immense by the standards of the time. But this winter was different. It arrived with a kind of creeping determination. Snow fell and didn't melt. Then ice, freezing over the stable troughs and clinging to the iron-bound gates. And then the stillness, the kind of silence that makes every sound in the courtyard echo louder than it should. Within weeks, even the heavy kitchen doors began to stick from frost. The cooks, normally bustling at all hours, found themselves whispering in corners about rationing lard and how much wood was left. The great feast, hall normally glowing with candlelight, salted meat, and songs sat silent, except on rare, increasingly austere occasions. But what truly changed life in the castle wasn't the dwindling stores or the frost-bitten fingers of the staff. It was the unexpected breakdown of its most basic institution, the movement of food. In most castles of the time, food began deep in the belly of the keep and kitchens, warmed by spits, clay ovens, and bubbling cauldrons. But in Stirling, that journey of warmth had to pass through stone corridors, drafty stairwells, cane-in-eated chambers before reaching the high tables of the nobility. And when the air itself seemed colder than the snow outside, those hot meals cooled into solid disappointment before they ever reached a plate. The first to complain was Lord John Stewart of Balvenie, cousin of the king and longtime court favorite. On the third day of frost, he slammed his trencher down with a force loud enough to echo off the tapestries. His beef stew had arrived half congealed. The fat on top had solidified into a yellow skin, and the carrots within had frozen into a strange, chewy texture that even the hounds sniffed at suspiciously. A council was called, not over war, not over trade or diplomacy, but over the temperature of food. Stewards were blamed. The scullery boy was whipped. One cook was sent to work in the stables to reconsider his calling. But none of this solved the fundamental problem. The castle's design, a testament to defense and grandeur, had never considered what would happen if heat itself became a prisoner. In response, a new strategy was devised. The meals would now be carried up, swaddled in heavy cloth, wrapped like infants in layers of linen, wool, and, in some cases, old fur cloaks. Servants marched up staircases, bearing bundles of food, as if transporting royal offspring. But even that didn't quite work. By the time the coverings were removed and the dishes placed on the table, steam had long since vanished, and the outer edges of roasted haunches cooled faster than the center could hold warmth. This led to the second wave of innovation, speed. Instead of a single large procession of dishes, meals were now served piecemeal. The hottest parts rushed to the table with shouted warnings like "make way for the goose" or "soup coming through." As if delivering munitions to a battlefield, the servants ran. They slipped. One fractured an ankle on the wet stones. Another dropped a gravy boat that shattered so dramatically it was mistaken for a fight in the lower hall. Even so, the nobles grumbled. They were used to being served, not rushed. Some began timing how long their food had taken to reach them and punished stewards whose estimates proved inaccurate. Sir Malcolm of Ink-Mahome refused to eat anything that had traveled more than 2 breaths worth from the oven. He spent most of winter half-starved, wrapped in a bear cloak and muttering about the privileges of summer. But while the nobles argued about timing and temperature, The real hardship simmered down below. The kitchens, now overworked and underheated, had become an endurance chamber. Fires had to be coaxed from damp wood. Ice formed on the inside of barrels. Knives stuck to wet palms. The cooks, once proud of their position in castle hierarchy, now spoke in quiet curses and traded ideas on how to keep meat from freezing solid between butchering and boiling. It wasn't just about warmth, it was about morale. Stirling Keep had always prided itself on its hospitality, especially during royal visits. Now, even the simplest stew arrived cold. And worse still, word began to spread. Messages, though delayed by snow and wind, reached Edinburgh. Tales of frozen roasts, and nobles warming their spoons before meals. Laughter followed. The king's own court jester was rumored to have composed a song called "The Dinner That Froze Mid-Bite." This, of course, only deepened the humiliation. Lord John Stewart, now even more irritable, ordered an emergency renovation of the dining hall. Servants were tasked with erecting canvas barriers inside the chamber to trap heat. These makeshift curtains fluttered miserably in the drafts. Candles guttered. One curtain caught fire and had to be doused with watered wine. Nothing worked. Nothing, except the most basic truth that no one wanted to accept. Food needed to be eaten near the kitchen. Not far from it, it was the castle's oldest chambermaid, a woman named Mab from the nearby village of Cambus Baron, who finally spoke what everyone feared. One evening, as she passed the steward, muttering about another cold chicken crisis, she said plainly, "Might as well eat downstairs. You've spent more firewood hauling cold up than you'd use warming one hall down there." The steward dismissed her at first, but the comment lingered. A week later, the nobles didn't begrudgingly in the outer kitchen chamber. It was awkward, cramped. A few complained of the smell, but the food was hot, and for the first time in weeks, no one muttered about the cold or shouted at a servant. For one strange, memorable evening, lords and ladies sat beneath hanging pans and smoked timbers, drinking thick soup straight from copper pots. There were no formal courses, no procession of silver platters, only warmth, flickering firelight, and the steady rhythm of spoons scraping bowls. And then someone no one remembers who laughed. Not mockery, not cruelty, just a real laugh at the absurdity of it all. A castle full of rooms, a staff of dozens, and yet the only way to eat a hot meal was in the kitchen like a peasant. That laugh changed something, not in the architecture, not in the rules of service or the ledger books, but in the memory. For years after, nobles would speak of the kitchen feast of 42 with a mix of embarrassment and fondness. Stirling Keep, once stiff with protocol, became just a little more flexible. And in a curious twist of fate, the kitchen chamber was refurbished, not with gold or tapestries, but with larger tables and stone benches, just in case another winter demanded humility. But winter was far from over, and a true test of Stirling's endurance had not yet arrived. As the snow outside Stirling Keep deepened into drifts that swallowed fence posts and turned roads into pale scars across the land, the nobles inside the stone fortress grew quieter. Not because the crisis had passed it, hadn't, but because the crisis had grown so tedious, so constant, so thoroughly baked into their daily lives, that to complain now felt redundant. Meals still arrived, lukewarm, if served in the great hall. Fires still smoked from half-green logs, and chamber pots still froze overnight, sometimes with hairline cracks where the expanding ice met the limitations of old clay. But after the infamous kitchen feast of 42, something had shifted in the spirit of Stirling's residents. Not joy, not resolve, just a slow, collective adjustment to the new rhythms of hardship. By late January, the outer storerooms had hardened like tombs. The salted meat that once hung from beams in linen bundles now rattled with ice crystals. The buttery churns were quiet, and the wine had to be warmed before it could be poured. The cellars, usually a source of comfort for the lords, how to become a trap of frozen barrels and corks that shattered like glass if handled improperly. A young steward named the Laster took it upon himself to redesign the storage routes. Previously, meat had traveled from the far west chambers near the outer wall a smart distance in summer, perhaps to reduce odor and pests. But now that distance meant spoilage by cold, not rot. Laster proposed to move in supplies into the laundry quarters, one of the few interior rooms still consistently warm due to steaming kettles and drying linens. This caused a quiet uproar. "You want our food next to the washerwomen?" Lord Carrick had asked, lifting an eyebrow as if the very suggestion stained his cloak. But the alternatives were no longer plentiful. Nobles, though powerful, had stomachs. Eventually, Alasdair won the argument, not through politics, but through proof. One evening, he served roast lamb directly from the laundry's copper pan, its steam still visible as it hit the tablecloth. The nobles grumbled. Chuden fell silent. Practicality had, for once, triumphed over pride. Not everyone adjusted with such grace. Lady Rosaline McLaren, a widow of some 20 years and famously fastidious, refused to eat anything not served in a pewter dish. When pewter froze to her fingertips one morning during a bitter breakfast of barley mash, she hurled the dish against the wall, left a dent, and a story that would be told in whispers for decades. The day Rosalind declared war on her own dining, where, in time, Sterling's cold became not just a nuisance, but a character and invisible resident, shaping the rhythm of daily life. Bread had to be sliced with warm blades, lest it crack and splinter. Coots were stored upside down to keep snowmelt from pooling inside. Hair, if left damp for too long, would crisp and snap at the ends. Stable boy named Fergus lost part of his left ear walking from the barracks to the bakery in the dark dot, and beneath this daily absurdity, a quiet resistance was forming. It didn't take the shape of rebellion. It wasn't the kind of revolt found in ballads or court documents. I bet it lived in small acts of refusal. A chambermaid who stopped sweeping unused rooms because her fingers bled from the cold. A cook who began seasoning everything with more salt, not because it improved flavor, but because salt crystals took longer to freeze. A group of guards who slept in shifts inside the armory, near the oil lamps, rather than their designated tower rooms. Even the clergy, typically removed from such domestic matters, adjusted their routines. Morning prayers were delayed by an hour to allow the chapel's interior to warm if only slightly from the sunlight. Sermons grew shorter. Kneeling was discouraged unless necessary. At one point, Father Declan delivered an entire homily while pacing rapidly in place, pretending it was a spiritual technique rather than a desperate attempt to keep blood moving in his toes. Back in the kitchens, a new figure had risen quietly to prominence. Her name was Granatall, soft-spoken woman from Argyll who had arrived as a fish cleaner 2 summers earlier. She wasn't particularly educated. She had no family within the castle, but she had one rare skill that earned her increasing influence. She knew how to smoke meat. Not just hang it, not just salt it, but truly smoke it in controlled chambers with hard wood, using old Highland techniques her mother had taught her during lean seasons in the glens. Grain understood the subtle differences between alder, birch, and beech, and how to wrap venison, haunches, in moss to prevent cracking in low moisture. When the kitchen fires burned inconsistently and food supplies grew fragile, Grain's smoked meats became essential. Her corner of the kitchen, once a back shelf near the scullery, was now warm with low-hanging smoke, sweet with juniper, and buzzing with quiet reverence. Even nobles began requesting her bar-crabbed pork by name, unaware of the labor it took to produce. She never asked for promotion. She never demanded attention. But by February, it was Grain, not the head cook, who had final say over meat storage. Firewood usage, in which animals were slaughtered first. The keep, in many ways, became two castles. One above, cold and ceremonial, full of silks and candle holders that did little to stop the frost, to one below, warm and practical, K, where smoke curled into every corner and survival was measured in degrees of heat, not hierarchy, but no wall is entirely solid. Even in medieval castles, information trickles upward. One afternoon, Lord John Stewart was seen walking Nana announced into the lower kitchens. His cloak was heavy, his face hidden in furs, and his expression unreadable. He said nothing to the staff. He simply walked the length of the room, past boiling cauldrons and spitted birds, and stopped near Grain's station. She looked up from her work, said nothing. He reached out, took a thin slice of smoked rabbit, laid on a wooden plank, and tasted it, then nodded and left. He never summoned her, never praised her in court. But the next morning, Grain received a delivery: 3 new iron pots, 2 bundles of dried rowan wood, and an extra woolen apron. Nothing written, no ceremony, just quiet acknowledgement. This strange truce between nobility and necessity continued. As the cold deepened, and yet, beneath all of it, questions remained. How much longer could Stirling Keep operate like this, cut in half adapted? What happened when the salt ran out? When the barrels cracked completely? Worse, what would spring bring? It was a pale, almost apologetic thaw that began in the first week of March. Not a grand arrival of spring not yet, but a loosening, a drip from the eaves. The way the frost on the windows no longer reached all the way to the frame. It was subtle, the kind of change you didn't notice until your boots no longer stuck to the floor each morning inside Stirling Keep. The transition was met not with celebration, but suspicion. No one trusted the weather. It had tricked them too many times, already delivering warmth one afternoon, only to bury the castle in black ice by nightfall. Still, there was no denying it. The chamber pots began to thaw before sunrise. The wool blankets stopped crackling with frost when unfolded, and the most telling sign of all, bread began to soften again. The kitchen fires, long dominated by the rhythms of survival, now found themselves in the awkward space between habit and change. Grain kept the smokehouse running, but the urgency faded. The salted stores, once guarded like gold, were now opened more freely. Even the kitchen staff, pale, calloused, and exhausted, began to linger again over simple things: a peeled apple, bowl of warmed milk, a pot of parsley beginning to stir in the window. Above stairs, the nobles fared less gracefully. Winter had, in some ways, unified the castle. Nobles and servants alike were at the mercy of cold, but now, with warmth, came a reassertion of difference. Orders became sharper, footsteps more confident. Lady Roseline, who had once nearly gone mad over a frozen goblet, resumed her post at the embroidery table with renewed criticism for the thread quality. Lord Carrick demanded a fresh robe each morning again, as if moths had nested in half. The closets, the temporary détente between rank and necessity, was melting just as surely as the snow in the courtyard. But the keep had changed in deeper ways. Grain, once a nameless kitchen assistant, now held quiet command over the food stores. She still never spoke at court. She never wore anything but her simple linen and wool. But her influence persisted when the head cook tried to resume his former control, proposing a return to roasted fowl and cheese boards. He found half his instructions overridden by notes in Grain's tight, practical script. Smoke remainder of ham. Store near chimney. Avoid excess lard turning sour. The meat stayed edible. Coop, after some protest, relented. Down in the servants' quarters, a quiet pride bloomed. The ones who had carried the logs, who had wrapped their fingers in scraps to stir pots and haul buckets, these were the ones who had kept the keep breathing. And though they would never be thanked aloud, there was something enduring in the nods they exchanged now, kind of shared recognition, The kind of thing born not of ceremony, but of survival. One morning, as the sun finally cleared the hills, Alasdair, the steward, stood in the central courtyard, counting the barrels of grain left over. His breath still formed clouds, but the cobblestones beneath his boots were bare. He had made a habit of tracking supplies every week through winter, a quiet ritual that kept his mind from unspooling. But this morning, he wasn't alone. Grain appeared beside him, holding a cloth-wrapped bundle of smoked trout. "Breakfast," she offered. He blinked. "From the southern chamber." She nodded, still a bit cold, but it thawed near the chimney, held together well. He took the parcel, opened it slowly, and broke off a piece. They stood there a moment, not speaking, watching as a pair of guards sloshed through the mud toward the stables. The snow was dissolving from the roof in great size, dripping down into the empty planters and puddling against the lower stone. "I heard the south road's clear," Alasdair said after a while. Grain only nodded. "Do you think people will remember?" he asked. "Remember what?" "That it was the lower rooms that kept them from starving, not the high table." She looked at him calmly, not unkindly. "People remember what suits them, not always what saved them." It wasn't bitter, it was simply true. And yet, a kind of memory did linger in the architecture of the keep itself. The wall near the laundry still held scorch marks from the makeshift stoves installed midwinter. The wooden beams above the smokehouse had turned a shade darker, resinous and smooth. The chapel pews still bore scratches from the boots of shivering worshippers who had rocked their feet to stay warm. Even the nobles, as try as they might, could not entirely erase the traces of adaptation. Their boots, once polished black, still bore the salt lines from countless frozen mornings. Their bed linens, aired out now for spring, retained the faint scent of the smoke that had crept under every door. The frost had taught them something, though. Whether they chose to remember was another matter. When the first trade cart arrived, its wooden wheels creaking and shedding clumps of slush, the castle exhaled as if it had been holding breath all winter. The driver brought sacks of oats, bundles of cloth, even lemons, a rare treasure, that were immediately brought to the high table for inspection. But he also brought stories of other keeps that had fared worse, of abbeys whose cellars had collapsed under the weight of ice, of lords who had fled their estates only to die frozen along the roads, of peasants who had resorted to boiling leather for sustenance. In comparison, Stirling had survived well, better than most, and it hadn't been by accident, nor by divine grace. It had been by labor, quiet, repetitive, unglamorous labor. In April, when the first green blades of onion grass began poking through the soil, and the bees began their lazy circuits along the castle walls, the nobles declared a feast, not a survival meal. A real feast. There was roast goose with apple glaze, buttered turnips, honey cakes, cordial wine. The whole hall smelled of spice and meat and warmth. The high table sat proud, dressed again in fur-lined garments. Guesters returned to their corners, musicians to their lutes. It was a ceremony of forgetting, but in the back, just past the tapestries, the kitchen staff held their own table quieter, simpler. Grain sat near the end, a bowl of broth in her hands. "Will you come up and be served at the noble table?" a messenger asked her. She looked up. "Will they come down and cook?" Blinked. "Well, no." "Then let it be." She drank her broth and said no more. That night, the castle fell asleep to a different sound, not the howl of wind, but the soft lapping of water from melting drifts. The chamber pots remained in place, but now they were just vessels again, no longer symbols of a world frozen stiff. And in the morning, when someone opened the shutters and found the grass fully exposed and the sky bluer than it had been in months, the keep seemed to sigh, as though the stone itself had been waiting for the thaw. But some questions lingered, even after the melt. What would happen next winter? Would the nobles remember what kept them alive? Would Grain still be in the kitchen? Or would her name vanish as surely as the frost from the windows? Is the true legacy of hardship when memory is a luxury of the powerful? In the winter of 1313, the sun rose late and thin over the French countryside. The ground, crusted in brittle white ice, made every step a negotiation of balance and discomfort, and in the sprawling, craggy shadow of the Chateau de Calais once, a proud limestone, a keep along the pilgrimage routes to Santiago, Compostela, the winter air bit like iron. The castle's lords spoke of the cold with frustration, but the servants beneath the floors of the main hall lived it with every breath. The year before, the harvest had come in late. The rains had lingered through October, ruining the grain. Some of the root vegetables had rotted in their beds. Then the frost had arrived early, turning even the best planned food cellars into spaces of doubt. As the snows deepened, it wasn't hunger that crept into the castle first. It was the cold in the servants' quarters beneath the kitchens. Firewood was rationed tightly. The nobility above demanded it for their hearths and bathwater. Down below, the servants made do with straw, shared breath, and whatever heat could trap in brick bread ovens after the loaves had come out. One room housed 12 men, another 16 women. Each pair of beds packed with bodies like bundled faggots of kindling. For the youngest among them boys, like Lucien, only 12, still red in the cheeks from autumn, there was a kind of harsh adventure to it. He was new to the chateau, traded from his village for a parcel of wool cloth and a promise of work. His job was to carry warm water from the kitchens to the upper rooms. But in January, that water would freeze before he reached the stairs. He learned quickly to insulate the buckets with torn wool. He learned to breathe against the stone steps before stepping on them, testing for black ice. He learned, most of all, to listen to the stillness in the morning. Because if there was no coughing, no clattering, no muttered prayers, someone had not survived the night. One such morning came with a peculiar quiet. It was late January, and the frost had not lifted in weeks. The chamber pot in the upper west turret had frozen solid. The waste had expanded as it turned to ice, cracking the ceramic vessel from within. The steward was furious. More caution, more frequent empties, he barked, unaware, perhaps uncaring, that the chamber pots were emptied by girls who slept 2 hours a night and had no gloves between them. Colette was one of those girls, 16, narrow-eyed, fast-handed, and quieter than she had any reason to be. She had once lived in a house with a thatched roof and chickens in the yard. Now, she kept the toilets clean for nobles who didn't remember her name. That morning, her shift began before the sun rose. She stood at the edge of the corridor, near the solar, holding a replacement pot. The broken one still sat inside, a jagged bloom of ice and waste. Removing it would mean bare hands, and the Lord's sister, who occupied the turret, had made it clear, no spills. Colette stared at the mess. Her breath fogged and fell in thick curls. Then she did what most of the servants did that winter. She bent low, set her jaw, and endured. Down. In the kitchens, the winter shifted how meals were cooked and for whom. Ovens were no longer for baking, but for keeping rooms above freezing. The head cook, a man named Raymond with frostbitten fingers wrapped in greasecloth, began rotating the ovens. One would be used for cooking, another as a heat source. But when even this wasn't enough, the servants resorted to lying directly on the warm stones once the bread came out. Grains were scarce. Lentils, safer in dry storage, became the base of nearly every meal. The lords complained of monotony, but the kitchen staff whispered thanks that lentils didn't spoil easily. The only meat came from occasional birds caught in the storerooms. Once, a raven got in and couldn't find its way out. The kitchen boys cornered it with nets meant for fishing. It became stew. No one asked questions, and then came the incident with the door. A large oak door, one that separated the west wing from the inner hall, froze in its frame. Ice had crept into the iron hinges during a thaw and refroze overnight, fusing the wood and metal like soldered joints. The lord of the castle demanded it be opened. Lucien was among the boys chosen to assist. They brought boiled water in buckets wrapped in cloth, pouring carefully along the hinges. It took an hour to thaw, another to pry it loose. When they finally opened it, the stench of moldy rushes and dead rodents rolled out. The corridor had not been entered in weeks. The lord declared it unfit and ordered it aired out. But no firewood was spared for that wing again. This is how priorities worked in the chateau. Servants' shoes froze to the floor. Hay was used to insulate everything, even around the chamber pots. And upstairs, the nobles complained that their feather beds were stiff as breadboards. One night, a low, groaning sound echoed through the foundation. A support beam in the cellars, long strained by moisture and cold, gave way with a slow crack. It didn't collapse, eating shifted. The next morning, visible band ran through the floor of the wine cellar. The lord considered it a minor inconvenience, but to the servants who stored the barrels, it was a death sentence. No one wanted to be beneath the beam when it fully gave, so they moved the wine to a higher room where it promptly froze. Thick ice caps formed on the corks. Some popped open. The floor turned sticky. Still, the wine was salvaged. It was boiled down with herbs and served warm, a thick gruel of fortitude that made the nobles feel festive again. No one mentioned the girls who hauled it up the stairs with bruised backs and bare hands. At night, Colette whispered the rosary in Latin, the only language that seemed safe to speak aloud. She curled against a wall near the stone hearth, the coals inside long dead. Across the room, Lucien coughed in his sleep. She had noticed that cough deepening, a wet, rattling sound. Another boy had died the week before. The priest mumbled something about penance and sleep, but everyone knew it was the cold, and the work, and the chamber pots, and the silence. Colette thought once about running away, but where could she go? The snowdrifts were high as a man's chest. The roads were closed. The woods were rumored to be thick with wolves, and even if she escaped, to what? No food, no shelter, no name that meant anything beyond the chateau's gates. So she stayed, and each morning she woke before the sun. She cracked the ice from the rim of her water bucket. She emptied the chamber pots. She didn't scream when her fingers bled from the frost. She didn't complain when her shift was doubled because another girl hadn't woken up. There was no romance to it, no glory, only the scraping of frozen earth beneath boots, the creak of timbers too cold to bend, the dull, persistent knowledge that winter could outlast even the strongest among them. And yet, something still flickered. One evening, while delivering blankets to the upper hall, Colette passed by the lord's study. She paused. To the door's small window slit, she saw him kneeling, not praying, but huddled near the fire, rubbing his hands, his lips pale and cracked. He was not immune. He had more food, more heat, more furs. But still, he suffered, and it struck her not as comfort, but as clarity. Cold did not care for titles. It had just been delayed in its climb downstairs. The younger girls were learning to wrap their feet in boiled rags before sleep. Grain sacks became cloaks, and when the pipes froze over entirely, they began melting snow in buckets above the hearth. They would survive, maybe, but spring still felt like a myth. The cold stretched on, and Colette, pressing her back to the stone wall one more night, stared at the ceiling and wondered, would anyone ever know how close they had come? Would anyone speak of the girls who dragged chamber pots through ice, or the boys who froze beside bread ovens? Would the records remember the frost that broke bone and trust alike? Or would history only remember who sat at the high table when the snow began to fall. The winter did not loosen its grip. If anything, it began to learn how to hold them better. By mid-February, the walls of the chateau began to behave strangely. Moisture condensed on the inner faces of the stone corridors at night, only to freeze in thin sheets by dawn. The older servants began referring to the walls as the watchers, always cold, always silent, always there. Lucien began to whisper about the ice being alive, listening. No one contradicted him. The castle had become a place where stone seemed to breathe and windows exhaled mist like tired lungs. One morning, while carrying a stack of coarse linen for the laundry, Colette slipped on a patch of unseen ice just outside the bread ovens. Her elbow caught the edge of a stair, and her side slammed against the wall hard enough to steal her breath. She lay there, stunned, for longer than she dared admit to herself. In that moment, she didn't cry. Not out of pride or courage, but because crying meant water, and water meant cold. She couldn't afford to give the cold anything when she stood. She left a small streak of blood where her hip had struck the stone. No one noticed. By that afternoon, it was hidden beneath a new skin of frost. The chateau's nobility held a feast once every 10 days, not because there was an abundance of food, but because the act of feasting was expected. A castle that didn't hold banquets was one where rumors might begin, rumors of weakness, of decline. So they dressed up wilted vegetables and salted pork as feast day roasts, and mixed sour wine with sweetened syrup to call it mulled. For the servants, feast days were the worst days. It meant double shifts. It meant fetching extra water and cleaning ash stains from the Lord's cloak with lemon rub and spit. It meant extra dishes, extra linens, and no food left for the lower kitchens. Lucien was pulled from water duty and assigned to spit turning during the February banquet. For 6 hours, he rotated the weight of a meager boar haunch before the hearth. His hands blistered from the proximity to the fire, but he kept his face turned toward the heat as long as he could. When he stood too long on one foot, his toes would scream from blood rushing back in. When the boar was done, he was given the leftover fat and a scorched bone. He carried it down to the laundry quarters where Colette was warming her hands over a bucket of steaming wash water she hadn't eaten in nearly a day. They shared it without speaking. That night, the first of the old women died. Her name was Mathorine. She had worked in the laundry for 30 years, and no one could remember a time when she hadn't been there. Her death was not dramatic. She did not cry out. She did not fall. She simply closed her eyes beneath the frostbitten wool blanket and failed to open them again. When they found her, she was half curled, her fingers pressed lightly to her lips, as if trying to whisper one last instruction. They buried her under the snow behind the pig pens. No priest came. Later that evening, Colette sat by the ovens again, legs drawn tight to her chest, watching the soft orange light lick the walls. She was not particularly religious, but she pressed her palms together anyway, not for salvation, for memory. She was afraid that even a name like Mathorine, which had lasted for decades, could vanish in a single week of cold. In the following days, the air inside the castle began to change. Not warmer than ever, but heavier. Breaths hung longer in the corridors. Cued, mold began to appear in the unused rooms again, soft and gray-green like rot blooming from the walls. The older beams of the upper hall groaned louder during the night, as if complaining after too much weight. And then, as if winter had one final cruelty to offer, the mice began to die. For months, the mice had been a nuisance gnawing through dried grain, darting through the storerooms, sometimes sneaking up the bed frames in the lord's chambers. The nobility ordered traps and poisons, but when the mice stopped showing up entirely, a deep unease settled over the staff. We weren't the only ones starving, one of the kitchen maids said in a quiet, flat voice. The mice were the early warning when even the vermin abandoned the halls. The castle began to feel less like a home and more like a tomb. The steward, a lean, sharp-jawed man named Etienne, made a new announcement. The lower kitchens would be consolidated. All fires in the east wing were to be extinguished. Only the main kitchen and the Lord's rooms would be heated. Any servants not directly involved with food or noble care were to sleep to a bed. Lucien was moved into the storage alcove behind the root cellar. No window, just a hollow space with a damp floor and the smell of turnips gone soft. He didn't mind. It was warmer than the corridor. Colette remained in the laundry quarters, but she began to notice something new. The women around her, once quick with gossip and muttered prayers, had begun to speak less and less. Silence crept in, not from fatigue, but from a strange sense of futility. Every word used energy. Every sentence taxed the breath. Colette counted this shift the same way. One might count frostbite spots with wary attention and quiet dread. One morning, as she bent over the washtub, her fingers went numb. Not the kind of numbness from brief exposure, a deep, hollow numbness. She held her hands up, looked at the reddened skin, saw that one of her fingernails had split clean down the center. She said nothing. That night, Lucien snuck into the laundry quarters and placed something at her feet, a square of cloth wrapped around a boiled potato. It was small, softened, barely food. Colette didn't ask where he got it. She just nodded. "'Kay." And for a moment, the watchers, the stone walls, the frost-covered beams, "'Kay." The ceiling that dripped and cracked seemed to pause in their vigil. They were not gone, but they were still by March. There were only 3 boys left on water duty. 2 of the bread ovens had collapsed under their own heat and weight. The Lord's wife stopped appearing at supper. It was whispered she had grown sick, but no one was allowed into her chamber. Outside, snow still fell, but the flakes were smaller, softer. The ground no longer groaned when walked upon. The frost didn't bite as hard in the early hours. And one morning, after weeks of grays and whites, a single blue line appeared on the horizon. Spring was not here, but it had remembered them. The days that followed brought change. Thin, almost pitiful, change but real. Meltwater dripped from the sloped tiles of the stables. Ice that had clung to the windows like barnacles began to retreat in patchy halos. A raven called from the edge of the tree lines. For the first time in 3 months, the road to Limoges was discussed again, not as myth, but as possibility. Inside the castle, something subtle shifted. Colette, scrubbing linens with torn hands and aching shoulders, caught herself humming under her breath. A nursery tune, old, from before the chateau. She didn't even notice she was doing it until another girl joined in. They smiled, briefly. Lucien found a bird's feather caught in the edge of the stable door. Not black, not crows, soft brown, sign of something returning. And one night, when the ovens were done baking, the youngest of the kitchen maids asked Colette if she wanted to lie near the bricks before they cooled. They didn't speak. They just closed their eyes. For the first time in months, the cold stayed outside of their bones, and the watchers, those walls that had seen so much, soaked up so much, seemed to blink dot, or maybe they wept, just a little. Frost would come again next year. The nobles would forget what had been endured. But Colette, Lucien, and the others would remember the long months of breathless survival, not with bitterness, not with pride, but with the quiet knowledge that the ice had tried to watch them die and failed. By the time the snow stopped falling altogether, most of the names that had once echoed through the corridors of Chateau de Calas had grown quiet. Servants rarely used names in full anymore. They spoke in nods, in glances, in soft throat clears, and finger gestures. To waste breath on syllables felt extravagant. And those who had not survived, like Mathorian, old Renee from the pantry, or Yvette, who coughed herself to sleep one night and never woke well, their names weren't said at all. Not out of disrespect, but because it hurt too much to remember people who had frozen only a few feet away. By mid-March, the great wooden doors at the castle's fronts, sealed for months against the storm, were pried open with iron levers. A path was dug through the layered snow. What emerged was not a triumphant return to the world, but a quiet release of stale breath from the lungs of a structure that had been holding it all in. The forest no longer looked like an enemy. It shimmered, instead wet, pale. Awakening, Lucian was among the first to walk the outer wall again. His knees were stiff, and the soles of his boots had been patched with boiled leather and prayer. The sun sat low but warm, and when it hit his neck, he paused, stood still, let it soak in. He cried without realizing it. No sobs, just tears down below. In the courtyard, Colette moved slowly from the laundry quarters to the stables. The snow there had melted into patches, leaving behind straw, ash, and long-forgotten dung. A foul scent, but not the scent of death. The scent of life returning. She passed the pig pens, where Mathurine had been buried under the frost. Now the snow had receded. A corner of the woman's shawl was poking up through the slush, caught on a broken fence post. Colette didn't touch it. She didn't need to. Just seeing it was enough. She knelt not to pray, not exactly, but to press her hand to the dark soil. Still soft from thawing, still here, she whispered. That was enough of a blessing. Inside the kitchens, the pots were light again. The root cellar had been nearly emptied, and what remained had gone soft or sour. But the steward, Etienne, had sent word to the town. A single messenger, cloaked and hooded, left the castle on horseback with a list of needs longer than his leg. Oats, lard, salt, cheese, rinds, needles, vinegar, onions, barley. But what they truly needed couldn't be listed to sleep. Peace, warmth not given by fire, but by people, the kind that doesn't vanish when the hearth burns out. The castle's nobility recovered quickly. They always did. Within a week, a tailor had been summoned to repair the Lord's waistcoat. Within 2 weeks, a feast was planned out of gratitude, but to reassert image. The banners were rehung. The dogs were brushed. The servants received no thanks, not a word. The ovens burned again, not for survival this time, but for status. Cold-trimmed plates returned to the table. Spoons of tin and bowls of wood returned to the scullery. On the first feast day of spring, Lucian stood by the doorway of the great hall and watched the nobles eat. Their laughter floated like smoke above the table. Their fingers glistened with fat. Not a single head turned toward the kitchens. Not a single mention of the dead. He turned away before they could see his face. Colette was back in the laundry. The floors were dry now, but the walls were still damp. She found herself folding garments more slowly, not out of laziness, but deliberately, as if each crease were a way of remembering. Its clothes had clung to shoulders that had survived. A season meant to kill them. She still had the potato cloth Lucian had given her, washed now, clean. She kept it folded under her sleeve as a kind of talisman, not for luck, but truth, because in that piece of cloth she remembered what the winter had really been. Not just cold, but silence, hunger, the look in someone's eyes when they were about to lie down and not get up again. The way the castle groaned at night, as if grinding its own teeth. And then, survival. By April, birds had returned to the trees. Real ones, this time, not just ravens. Colette saw a small finch land on the outer wall one morning and sing a dry, clumsy note. It startled her. She realized she hadn't heard birdsong in months. It made her smile in the garden. Sprouts pushed their way through old mulch. The ground was still hard beneath, but they rose anyway, determined. A few herbs remained in the corner bedtime, mostly bitter and small, but strong. The servants were allowed to grow small things again. Colette planted leeks, Lucien tried to grow peas in a bucket. Another girl named Marie found wild mint behind a well and transplanted it near the laundry so they could smell something green while they worked. They didn't talk about the winter, but they built things. They mended what broke. They left dry bread in the corners for the mice who had returned without apology. They sang against off-key while working, and they named the nameless again. They whispered old names in the stables, in the alcoves, by the pig pens. Mathurine, Renee, Yvette, names the nobles had never said. Names that weren't worth writing down. Names remembered not in books, but in blisters and ash. Shared food and torn shawls. They had survived, not because of firewood or orders, but because they made warmth out of almost nothing. Because when the snow forgot their names, they remembered each other. It is easy now to think of nobility as a glittering class, people adorned in fur, gold-threaded sleeves, and warm beds behind heavy tapestries. But even in the wealthiest keeps, there were winters that mocked every velvet curtain and silenced every golden bell. This story begins not in hunger, but in vanity. In the year 1312, in the eastern slopes of the Pyrenees, lived a woman whose name rarely passed the lips of commoners without some combination of fear, awe, and confusion. Duchess Isabeau de Foix. Her family had long ruled from Chateau d'Arcus, a mountain fortress not far from the border of Aragon, where snow often came early and overstayed its welcome. Isabeau was not beloved by her subjects, but she was remembered. She was a woman of rituals, morning-scented oils, silk slippers changed every day, and baths drawn every other dawn, even in the harshest months. Even when the kitchen staff had to break blocks of ice from the castle's cistern, even when the servants' hands turned purple lifting buckets, while the village huddled around. Charcoal fires and gnawed on barley bread, dipped in mustard seeds. Isabeau sat neck-deep in wooden tubs lined with linen, sipping wine warmed by firestones. It wasn't cruelty, exactly, okay? It was detachment. She had never been taught to feel cold the way others did. She had never been taught to listen for how quiet a servant becomes when frostbite is crawling up their leg. The castle's heating system, such as it was, relied on braziers, fire grates, in the hopes of servants who lived on roasted onions and bone broth. During that winter of 1312, the snow came so thick that the outer doors froze shut. The drawbridge rope cracked from the cold. It took 3 days before someone could climb to the watchtower and confirm the bridge was now just a sheet of white. But still, the Duchess bathed. Her chambers were lined with tapestries from Flanders and rugs from Iberia. Her bathwater was warmed with stones fetched from the kitchen hearth and cooled just slightly with handfuls of snow melted in a copper pan. She liked it just above body temperature, warm enough to steam, not so hot it turned her cheeks red. Her personal maid, Agnes, was the one who measured the heat, not with instruments, but with her own wrist. She would dip her fingers in, then press them to her forearm. The warmth lingered 5 seconds. It was correct. If it vanished in 3, it was too cool. Agnes did this ritual every other day, often barefoot, often while coughing, because the castle's stores were full of linens and spices, but not of medicine. There was cinnamon from the Levant, cloves from Venice, but no honey left for the sick. The bees had not survived the autumn. In the lower quarters, where servants shared beds and cooked by flame alone, winter had already started taking its toll. One of the kitchen boys lost the tips of 3 fingers. A scullery girl fainted from hunger and cracked a tooth on the stone floor. The ice on the floor didn't melt for 3 days, even with fire in the grate. But still, okay, the Duchess bathed to Isabeau. The world was meant to be softened by heat and oil. Even her chamber pot was cleaned daily, its porcelain rim wiped with rose water-soaked cloth. She did not see the steam that hovered above the water bucket as anything more than ambience. She didn't smell the burnt fingertips of the boy who fetched the firestones, and she certainly didn't notice when the copper pan went missing one morning, taken by a desperate laundress to boil snow for soup. The missing pan caused an uproar, not from the Duchess herself, who merely remarked that her tea had cooled too fast, but from her steward, Lord Hugas, who interrogated the laundry room with threats of cutting rations. No one confessed, and the pan was never found. It had been used quietly to save 3 children who had not eaten warm food in 2 days. The bath continued, but then the ice came indoors. It began with the windows. The older panes, made of leaded glass and horn, had started to buckle from the pressure of packed snow outside. A crack formed in the corner of the Duchess's study. Frost crept in like a silver claw. Agnes tried to cover it with cloth, but within days, the draft had settled in the Duchess's private corridor. The brazier had to be moved closer to the bathing tub. This meant someone had to stand beside it, feeding logs steadily, or the bath would not steam properly. It became Agnes's job. She now spent over 2 hours each morning crouched beside a fire, watching water swirl. She no longer sang while she worked. Her lips had split from the dryness. Her knuckles were raw. The nails on her index finger had turned blue. But the Duchess noticed none of this, not until Agnes fainted one morning while lifting the final jug of hot water. She collapsed into the tub with a loud splash, sending warm water over the floor, soaking a rolled rug, extinguishing one of the coals. Isabeau stood, not in concern, but in outrage. "You've ruined it," she hissed. "This water is spoiled now. You'll fetch more." But Agnes couldn't terrorize her. Lips were moving, but no sound came out. Her breath steamed against the air for only a moment, then vanished. 2 guards were called to carry her out. The Duchess dried herself with a linen cloth, complaining all the while about the waste of cinnamon, the burnt wood scent in her hair, and the draft that no one had yet fixed. She never asked if Agnes survived, and she didn't notice that the next maid to enter her chamber wore the same dress, mended at the cuffs, but carried herself with silence instead of reverence. Her name was Margot. She was Agnes's cousin, and she was already angry by the end of the week. The bath ritual resumed. The snow still towered outside the castle walls. The kitchens still rationed turnips, and the servants had begun whispering not just about food, but about change, because when water becomes precious and heat becomes survival, a bath can start to look like a war. And in Chateau, Dark's steam was no longer a symbol of luxury. It was a symbol of waste. Something was going to shift. The temperature outside was still dropping, but the fire inside was beginning to rise. And so the question lingered: what happens when even the most loyal hands begin to let the water boil? They say that nobles could insulate themselves from the world with wool and silk, that behind thick doors and tapestried walls, they remained untouched by cold or consequence. But in truth, even castles breathe, and with the breath of a fortress, turns to steam and rot. It spreads not just through stone, but through silence. In the days following Agnes's collapse, the bathwater ritual did not stop. Margot, her cousin, now sworn to silence by necessity, took her place with lips pressed together in movements that mimicked obedience but lacked devotion. She never spoke unless addressed. She warmed the stones, carried the jugs, folded the linens with the same motions Agnes once used. But she did not check the temperature with her wrist. She used a thin strip of boiled wool, dipped briefly, then withdrawn. She marked its heat by color, not sensation, and she let the water go ever so slightly cooler. The Duchess did not notice, or if she did, she said nothing. Her skin had already begun to harden with the air. She simply asked for her bath oil to be warmed slightly longer, and for the window to be closed with a wedge of cloth. But what she didn't know, what no one upstairs knew, was that Margot was not just a maid. She had once been the daughter of a beekeeper from Foix, educated enough to read, quiet enough to survive. She knew how water moved through stone. She knew where the servants spoke. She had begun to listen. Word was spreading, not through shouting, but through a deeper cold kind that settles when people begin to share food without asking, when they begin leaving the kitchen door unlatched, when they nod instead of bow. One day, the kitchen fire burned out in the middle of the night. No one claimed responsibility. The cook simply muttered that the wood was damp. The chimney sweep said nothing at all. And Margot, upstairs in the bathing chamber, added 2 extra logs to the brazier. Not because the Duchess asked, but because she wanted to see how quickly they would disappear. By the 3rd week of frost, the outer gate was frozen, shut entirely. Not just locked but sealed, the iron warped by snowmelt and ice. One of the guards tried to wedge the door open with a crowbar, but the iron shrieked against stone and refused to budge. The penis cracked like old teeth, and the effort was abandoned before sundown. That night, they double-bolted the inner gate and said nothing more. The castle had become a sealed chamberland, echoing basin of privilege and rot. The Duchess, meanwhile, continued her ritual with eerie precision. The bath was drawn at the same hour each morning, and Margot warmed the copper kettle with the same .com hand. Each movement was deliberate, just slow enough to suggest care, just quick enough to discourage questions. Agnes, still pale and dazed, had been officially sent home to her village. At least, that was the story told to visitors. In truth, she had been bundled into a wool-lined cart and escorted to the monastery infirmary 3 valleys away. Her skin marked by frostburn and her eyes unfocused. She hadn't spoken a word since, and the Duchess did not ask after her. Instead, she filled her silences with requests: slices of pear, boiled in wine, petals scattered in her water, embroidered towels laid out in warming drawers. She remained ensconced in her tub, surrounded by a world of melted ice and floral steam. While outside the halls, the wind moaned like a hungry widow. But the staff had begun to count things, not openly, never with parchment or pen, but in glances. How many logs were taken from the stack each day? How long the scullery maid lingered before feeding the fire? How many steps it took from the kitchen to the Duchess's chamber with a full kettle? They whispered of change, not as a rebellion, but as a slow erosion. And Margot became the quiet center of it one evening. As the light thinned to silver across the courtyard, Margot found herself alone in the bath chamber. The Duchess had taken to napping after her scrapped in 5 layers of linen and goose-feather quilts, her skin still glistening from the lavender oil. Margot refilled the kettle and stared into the open fire. She had noticed something new. That morning, a hairline crack in the copper basin beneath the tub. Just a tiny line, but one that oozed heat when the water sat for too long. She'd mentioned it to the steward in passing. He had shrugged. She wanted a new one in spring, he said, stirring his tea with a dry leaf. There's no getting one now. So Margot watched it. Each day, she measured the length of the crack with a grain of barley. Each day, it widened, just a touch. It wasn't sabotage, wasn't even neglect. It was simply time, pressing its fingers against the edges of comfort. The next frost came in the form of sound, or rather, the absence of it. The kitchens were quiet, now wearily so. The dogs in the courtyard had stopped barking. Keeve in the stables, usually restless from trapped heat and manure, had fallen still. A plague of silence had settled over the keep, and it unnerved even the most seasoned guards. Margot, meanwhile, began boiling the water slower. She used fewer coals. She allowed the Duchess's bath to cool just a touch before announcing it was ready. And in those moments, just seconds, really steam would drip toward the ceiling, linger like a ghost, and vanish. The Duchess would say nothing, she would lower herself into the tub with a hiss and a shudder, closing her eyes, imagining herself far from the world of creaking stones and forgotten doors. And Margot would stand beside her, holding a dry towel, imagining the sound the copper basin might make if the crack finally gave way. One morning, it happened, not with drama, not with a scream, but with a sound so faint, so deeply unremarkable, that it took a full minute for Margot to register it. The tub had sagged, a single rivet had slipped loose, a faint trickle of water began to pool beneath the planks of the floor, and the Duchess' eyes closed. Arms draped over the side did not. Notice Margot didn't warn her. She knelt beside the basin, pressing a hand against the floor, watching the water snake along the grain of the wood like a river searching for home. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She stood, smoothed her apron, whispered, "My lady, shall I prepare your towel?" The Duchess nodded without opening her eyes, and in that moment, Margot knew she could control the temperature, the silence, and the very shape of the water, all without raising her voice. Outside, snow thickened. Two of the guards deserted that week's, slipping away under the cover of night, with their boots wrapped in cloth and a small sack of barley tucked beneath their cloak. No one sounded the alarm. The steward noted their absence, but said only 2 fewer mouths. Inside, Margot added extra wool to her slippers. The Duchess began coughing at night, quietly at first, but then, with more persistence, a shallow, hollow sound. Not from illness, exactly, but from the dryness of the air and the constant transition between heat and cold. She asked for a bath to be drawn earlier. She requested cinnamon bark and warm honey to soothe her throat, and Margot, still silent, still measured, complied. But the coals in the brazier were no longer as hot, and the basin, each day, gave a new groan as the hot water met cold metal. The servants began wearing gloves indoors. The steward stopped attending meals, and still, the Duchess bathed. One night and, unusually still one Margot, remained in the bathing chamber longer than usual. The Duchess had retired early, complaining of aching joints. The fire had died to embers, and Margot sat beside the copper basin, staring at her reflection in the cooling water. She looked older than she remembered, not tired, just distant, as if her body had drifted several seconds ahead of her thoughts. She ran a finger along the edge of the basin and felt it tremble. The crack had split halfway, across the base. Tomorrow, it might leak completely. She could tell the steward. She could request a new basin from the village blacksmith. She could even draw the bath in a wooden barrel until spring. But she did none of these. Instead, she dipped her hand into the water, lukewarm now, let it rest there, just long enough for her skin to redden, just long enough to remember the sensation of cold creeping in. And when she withdrew it, she whispered to the darkness, "Soon, night." Next day, the Duchess collapsed, not dramatically, not in the tub. She simply stood too quickly after her soak. The room too cold, the steam too thin. Her foot slipped on a patch of damp tile, and her knee gave way. She crumpled onto the wooden mat like laundry. Margot, standing nearby, did not catch her. She wrapped her in a towel. She helped her to bed, and when the physician arrived, 3 hours later, he prescribed rest, garlic broth, and thicker socks. But the Duchess never entered the bath again. She took 2 sponge baths, applied with trembling hands. She stopped asking for rose petals. She no longer requested oils or cinnamon. The basin remained in the corner, empty, silent, quaked. No one moved it, and Margot no longer tended the fire. She had learned that warmth, once hoarded, turns to ice when shared with no one, and sometimes it is the smallest crack that empties a kingdom. The chamber pot sat beneath the bed again, not because of any sudden change in custom, but because the Duchess no longer had the strength to walk to the privy alcove behind the velvet curtain. It was plain porcelain pale, hairline cracks visible. Around the remand, it froze solid that first week after her fall. A sheen of delicate frost formed over the rim before the footman could empty it. That morning, Margot found herself chipping away at the edge of it with a small knife and a cloth. More out of instinct than duty. Something about the act felt familiar, and in a way, full circle. All the fires in the east wing had been extinguished by order of the steward. The wood supply was dwindling rapidly, and what remained had to be preserved for the kitchen, the guard tower, and the chapel. The Duchess's once steaming bath chamber stood silent and still. The copper basin remained in its place, cold and useless. Its once glowing body now acted as a bitter echo of winter itself, biting to the touch. The physician, visiting twice a week now, made fewer notes each time. "She's simply cold," he said at one point, unwrapping her foot to check for signs of circulation. But then again, so was the rest of the castle. He looked tired, his wool collar dusted with snow that hadn't melted even inside the chamber. The Duchess would not meet his eye. Her gaze drifted toward the window, where frost traced feathered patterns along the glass. She whispered, "I missed the steam." No one responded, because everyone, silently, felt the same. Downstairs, the staff huddled. Close now. Formerly distant kitchen hands now sat shoulder to shoulder near the hearth, rubbing their palms together and stealing glances toward the dwindling log pile stacked beneath the central stairs. Even the steward, usually aloof and separate, had taken to sharing the bench closest to the coals, but the whispers persisted. She still expects a heated cloth for her hands. She's asked for pears again. Where are we to find pears? She said the blanket smells of soot. Of course it smells of soot. It's been by the fire. Each voice dipped just low enough not to reach the Duchess's ears, but not so low that Margot could ignore them. Margot had stopped defending the requests weeks ago. Not out of rebellion, but out of fatigue, okay? The kind of fatigue that enters your bones and never quite leaves, okay? The kind that makes you forget the face you had last spring. She now slept on a cot in the corridor outside the Duchess's chamber. The mattress was thin, and her boots never came off completely. But it was warmer than the cellar, and less watched than the maid's quarters. Sometimes at night, she could hear the Duchess talking in her sleep. Not words, just patterns of breath, as though she was still immersed in her bath, surrounded by lavender and heat, floating in a world that had already melted away. The day the basin was finally removed was a quiet one. No announcement, no ceremony. It took 3 men to carry it out of the bath chamber, okay? They used thick rags to grip the cold metal and muttered to one another as they navigated the stairs. The crack had spread across the entire underside now, jagged as lightning. It leaked even in the cold, and when touched by sunlight, it wept rust. No one asked where it was taken. Some say it was thrown into the frozen pond behind the chapel. Others claimed it was dismantled and refashioned into hinges and nails. Margot never looked for it. Its absence left a space in the room like a pulled tooth smooth, hollow, inevitable dot. In its place, a wooden chair was placed, with a bowl and cloth folded neatly upon it. The steam never returned, but the Duchess's silence did in the days that followed. She began to speak less and less. First, she stopped asking for food by name. Then, she ceased to greet Margot at all. Eventually, even her glances, faded eyes, unfocused, turned always toward the window, where frost etched its slow journey down the glass. Margot adjusted to the new rhythm. She brought water. She wiped hands. She dabbed her brow with a cloth cooled in the corridor. But something gnawed at her, the sensation of watching something vanish, not all at once, appease, but grain by grain. One evening, as the sun fell without much light at all, the Duchess finally spoke. Her voice was thin and dry, as if pulled through layers of muslin. "Do you remember when it rained?" Margot blinked. Yes, Kay, she said slowly, but she didn't. Not really. Rain felt like a story someone had once told in a warmer place. The Duchess's lips cracked as she smiled faintly. I used to watch it from the turret. Kay, the water would hit the stone and slide down in little silver threads, like melted glass. Margot nodded. She wanted to say something comforting, but there was nothing soft left in the air. The wind howled against the window pane. By the last week of February, nearly everyone in the castle had taken ill, dry coughs, stiff joints, fingers. Wrapped in rags, the steward rationed what little brandy remained, doling it out as if it were holy water. Bread was harder now, and the root vegetables had begun to grow small white hairs in the corners of the pantry. The dogs hadn't barked in days, and still, Terra Duchess asked for her basin, not aloud, not even with gesture, but in the way her gaze lingered on the empty space beside the fire. One evening, Margot brought in a basin of her own. It was tin, not copper, small and shallow, just large enough to hold a loaf of bread or a bundle of socks. She filled it with warm water, just enough to steam. She placed it near the fire. She let the scent of rosemary drift upward from the surface, and for the first time in weeks, the Duchess closed her eyes and smiled. It was the smallest gesture, but the room softened, just a little. When spring finally came, if one could call it, that came with more mud than flowers. The frost melted unevenly, leaving ridges in the soil and swollen puddles between cobblestones. Crow nested above the gatehouse. The chapel bells rang again, though off-key. But the Duchess did not rise from her bed. She had not bathed in over 2 months. She no longer ate full meals, but her hands, oddly, were always clean. Each day, Margot would warm a cloth and wash them, gently, one finger at a time. She would wrap them afterward in soft linen and place them upon her chest like petals on snow. And each night, the basin remained steaming, though now more ritual than hygiene. One morning, as the sky turned a color of wet chalk, the Duchess took Margot's hand and said, "You kept me warm." And then she did not speak again. The Duchess passed quietly, without illness, without drama, just a slow drift into stillness. The physician called it exhaustion. The steward called it inevitable. The staff did not speak at all. She was wrapped in wool and carried to the chapel in the same chair where she once took her sponge baths. The window remained open during the service, and for the first time in months, a gust of true warmth touched the room. A single bird sang. Margot did not cry, but that night, she placed the tin basin in the fireplace and washed it. Black and Dot, she had learned that cold doesn't only live in winter. It lingers in memory and stone, in quiet rooms, in the spaces between what was expected and what actually arrived. And for many years after, the chamber remained unused. The cracked copper tub was never spoken of again, and those who remembered the Duchess, the one who once bathed in melted ice while the castle froze, so only in whispers, as if saying her name too loudly might summon the cold again, as if silence itself had become a kind of heat. The kitchen was always the warmest place in the castle, even when the frost crept in under the windowsills, even when icicles hung like daggers from the rafters in the northern corridor. The kitchen held heat like an animal curled in straw. It clung to the stones, nestled deep in the walls, and rose up in soft waves from the great hearth that had been burning since the day the castle was first mortared. But the fire never reached the floorboards. That was where Gertrude worked, near the bottom of the kitchen hierarchy and very nearly near the ground itself. Her knees were always wet, her fingers always red, her apron always dotted with a chalky white trace of coarse salt, flour, or snow scraped from a boot. She was not a chef, not even a cook. She was the one who kept things clean and edible and just warm enough not to grow mold. And in the year the blizzard lasted until May, Gertrude became the most important person in the castle. Not that anyone admitted it at the time. The first sign of crisis wasn't the snow, it was the missing salt. 2 sacks, of course. Salt had vanished from the larder shelves. Just gone. No spill, no trace. The steward accused the scullery boys of selling it to the traveling wine merchant. The boys denied it. The merchant had frozen in his wagon half a mile from the southern gate. Gertrude said nothing. She simply folded her apron, tied it again, and stepped back out into the snow. Clutching a small wooden bowl like a sacred relic, she walked to the stables, not for the horses, which had long since been relocated to the chapel to preserve their body heat, but for the old brining barrels buried in the root cellar beneath the stable floor. The salt that had lined them was old, pink, and dry as bone. She scraped every grain into her bowl and carried it back like powdered gold. That day, the kitchen served broth, no bread, no onions, just broth, salted by history, stirred over an open flame, and not a single complaint. Because when your boots are frozen to your feet and your hands burn from cold, even near the fire, salt becomes a form of worship. Gertrude didn't sleep much, not out of obligation, out of worry. She knew the stock levels better than the steward. She had counted the number of withered parsnips remaining in the bin and how many days the dried fish could stretch if thinly shaved and soaked overnight in cabbage water. She knew how many drops of tallow remained for candles and how long a single pine knot would last in the fire before it popped and died. But more than anything, she knew snow. She had been born in it, swaddled in it, had her first cider in it, and she knew, just by the sound of wind against the eastern shutters, that this was not ordinary snow. It fell sideways. It hissed when it hit the stone, and when it melted on the kitchen windows, it left behind a faint trace not of clean water, but of ash dot by the 3rd week. She began salting the snow. It started as a mistake. One of the sacks had burst open, spilling into the fresh pile just inside the back door. Gertrude, ever frugal, scooped it up anyway. She melted it down in the stock pot, tasted it, and paused. It didn't taste like snow. It tasted like water that had memory, like something scraped from the past and simmered into the present. And from that moment on, she salted every pot, not just for flavor, but to bind the water, to give it shape, to trick the mouth into thinking it had eaten something worth chewing. She began to mark the best patches of snow, the ones with the right texture, the right clarity. She learned which drifts held more bitterness, which ones had soaked up too much soot. It was a quiet alchemy practiced beneath the kitchen arches. Long after the steward had gone to bed, people began to notice, not immediately, but subtly. The guards stopped looking gaunt. The kitchen girls started humming again as they stirred. Even the chamberlain who once slapped Gertrude's wrist for using too much barley nodded to her in passing. They didn't know what had changed, only that the broth was warming in a different way than before, as though something had shifted quietly beneath the tongue. Then came the feast. It was not meant to be a feast. Of course, it was simply a meal in the Duke's hall, an attempt to lift morale. A fire was lit in the great hearth. Tapestries were brought down from the storage rooms to cover the cracked windows. The musicians were asked to play a slow, old song that didn't require instruments to be in perfect tune, and Gertrude was told to prepare something substantial. She did not complain. She merely walked back into the kitchen, rolled up her sleeves, and began. She had 1/2 wheel of goat's cheese beginning to bloom with gray, a sack of winter carrots, brittle as chalk, 2 jars of pickled beetroot, 3 handfuls of dried bread, and snow. So she salted it, boiled it, filtered it through cloth. She shaved cheese into it, mashed beetroot for color, and layered carrots in overlapping slices like coins of copper around the edge of each plate. She toasted the bread over pine cones to give it smoke, and when the food was laid out, no one spoke for a moment, because it smelled real as though spring had passed briefly through the hall. The Duke said nothing, but he finished his plate, and that night, no one rang the bell for midnight bread. Gertrude had done what no fire could do. She had made warmth edible, but the snow was not infinite. By the 5th week, even it had grown dull-tinged with soot, peppered with ash, threaded with coal dust and horse sweat. It no longer melted clean. Gertrude adapted. She began to mix snow with crushed cinders from the fire grate. Just a pinch. It gave the broth a smoky flavor and disguised the bitterness. She used her own apron strings as wick ties to craft small candle pans, melting down the last scraps of wax to create heat for one more pot. She no longer tasted every batch. There wasn't time. There wasn't strength. Her arms ached. Her back creaked like a beam in the roof. But she stirred. She salted, and the castle stayed. Alive, just barely. The day the sun returned, no one noticed it. First, because the sky was still white, still dense. But the wind shifted, and for the first time in months, a drip was heard from the gutter above the kitchen window. A real drip, a rhythm, a change, the kind of sound that doesn't matter until it does. Gertrude looked up from the pot. She didn't smile, just nodded, because she knew salt, in the end, had preserved more than food. It had preserved hope. She untied her apron, folded it once, and placed it on the stone beside the fire. The floorboards were still cold, but the room no longer was. There was a pig once, a small one, barely half-grown, kept not for slaughter, but for scraps. It was supposed to be used for breeding, or perhaps traded in the spring for a bundle of oats and a jug of wine. But the spring never came, and so, when the snowdrifts swallowed the courtyard walls, and even the doves stopped returning to the bell tower, the steward sent for the pig. It had no name, it had no place left to run, and it did not squeal when they took it. It only blinked once, as if it had already known. The fire in the great hearth had been reduced to smoldering embers. Even the dry wood was damp now. Everything was damp. And the smoke refused to rise, clung to the floor like a curse, curling around boots, coats, and pans. The pig was hung low over the coals and turned slowly, not by hand, but with a rusted chain looped to the elbow of the hearth hook. The meat didn't roast, it sweated. The fat dripped too slowly. The skin blistered unevenly. The room smelled like regret. Gertrude watched from the side, not as cook, not as kitchen staff, but as the only person who knew how to make broth out of smoke, because that was all they had left now, and the pickle ready. Half gone was not going to last through the week, in the deep dark of winter. Things happen slowly. Food doesn't rot in the usual way. It doesn't grow mold or spoil. It just loses interest in being food. The cheese had long ago dried into stone. The root vegetables had shriveled into shapes that could only be softened by boiling them for hours in salted water. Even the black bread, when sliced, left behind flakes like slate dot. Gertrude had learned to listen for the shift. A carrot that snapped too cleanly was dead. One that bent ever so slightly still had promise. An onion that rattled when shaken meant rot inside. A potato with eyes still awake could be peeled thinly and reborn in a stew. And so she peeled, she stewed, she soaked, ground, scraped, boiled, and salted. Salt had become her religion. She kept it in little linen bags tied to her apron strings. She salted water, salted fat, salted ashes. She salted the snow, salted the drippings, even salted the hollowed bones left from the pig roast. Because, in salt, things could live longer, and survival, by this point, was just an extended version of dying slowly, with dignity. The meat, such as it was, became memory after 3 days. The pig was gone. No leftovers, no scraps, no fat to render. Gertrude had used the hooves for gelatin, the head for stew, the bones for stock, and the smoke from the fire was saved in the soot collected along the hearth, all scraped gently into a cloth pouch and used to flavor the next boiling. Some said they could still taste the meat long after it was gone. That was the miracle Gertrude's soup smoke fed, bone hollow, as salted, held memory. A memory of warmth, a memory of marrow. She could stretch one turnip across 5 servings. She could slice a single clove of garlic so thin it seasoned a whole pot. And in a world without more pigs, that was survival. No one asked how she did it. Not the steward, who had once accused her of hoarding salt. Not the chamberlain, who now sent silent nods in her direction during supper. Not even the duke, who never spoke to kitchen staff unless there had been a banquet. But when the duke's son fell ill cold too, the touch, refusing broth, and burning with fever from within. They did not call for the physician. They called for Gertrude. She arrived with a towel tucked in her belt, her sleeves already rolled, and a pot of snow already melting over a small flame. She did not kneel. She did not ask questions. She boiled snow. She salted it, and when the water turned clear and the room smelled faintly of the old pig smoke, she ladled the spoonful into a horn cup and held it to the boy's lips. He drank once, coughed, and slept. The next day, the fever broke. No one asked what was in the broth. No one dared. Outside, the snow had become hostile. It no longer crunched. It screamed, shrill, sharp, a high-pitched scrape of air against itself. The shutters no longer held. The draft crept in, even under the beds. The kitchen was the warmest room in the castle, now sat barely above freezing, but the broth stayed hot because Gertrude had built a system. She burned everything, corks from empty wine bottles, splinters from broken chairs, bits of dried leather cut from boot soles and old harnesses, even the tallow-soaked bandages from the infirmary. Once they'd hardened, became fuel, and the fire lived on. She used a cast-iron pot with a lid so dented it looked more like a shield. The pot had survived 3 kitchen stewards, 2 wars, and 1 chimney collapse. It would survive this dot inside it. Melted snow, salted bones, smoked onion skin, garlic paper, crumbled crusts, decay, and whatever herbs still clung to the dried wreath. Above the mantel, a few strands of thyme, 1/2 leaf of laurel. It was enough. It had to be. Some nights, the kitchen didn't sleep. Gertrude sat by the hearth, dozing with her cheek on her palm, listening to the pot breathe. The cookmaids snored in shifts on sacks of flour. Mice no longer scurried. Even they had run out of options. The only movement came from the pot, the slow, rhythmic burble of something becoming something else. That was her magic, not the ingredients, the patience, the persistence, the refusal to serve cold water and call it stew. She boiled until it meant something, until the smell alone gave people reason to lift their heads. It wasn't feasting. It wasn't celebration. It was remembering what food used to feel like. And in the quiet cold, that was enough then. One morning, the birds returned, just 2 of them, tiny, dull, brown, no song, just cute, dark eyes peeking down from the smoke beam above the hearth. They didn't move, didn't chirp, but they were there. And Gertrude, pausing with her spoon mid-stir, saw them, and she smiled for the first time in months, because birds mean thaw, they mean seed, they mean the snow. Ice begun to consider retreat, and soon the ground beneath it might remember how to live. But the stew still boiled, because the ground would take. Time and hunger would not wait. And though the pig was gone, and the carrots had withered, and even the garlic bulbs had dried to husks, Gertrude had one thing left, a jar of ashes, saved from the bottom of the pan the day to pick fat. Burned too hot, mixed with salt, and kept for last. She opened the jar, tipped a pinch into the pot, stirred, and the broth darkened not in a foul way, but like ink returning to a forgotten letter. And she ladled it out, served it, and no one spoke, because silence sometimes is the only thank you worth giving. The thaw did not arrive all at once. It never does. There were no trumpets, no floods, no sudden collapse of snowbanks, only small surrenders. The frost on the interior of the window panes began to weep. The water bucket left near the hearth stopped, forming a crust overnight. In the chamber, pots frozen stiff for months, now sloshed when carried. You might think this would bring relief, but thaw brings rot where once there was cold preservation. Now there was stench. The courtyards turned to sludge. The hay that had once lined stalls became sodden mats of mold. The dried fish stacked carefully along the stone cellar walls began to sag in their skins, and the smell followed the wind into the high halls. And in the kitchens, something new began to appear. Flies, not many, just one or two, black, slow, groggy from sleep, but flies nonetheless. And where flies can survive, decay follows. Gertrude knew this was not the end of hardship. It was the beginning of a new form. She doubled the salt, burned the bread that had gone soft, turned the last hard roots into mash, and dried them flat on the back of the oven door, like pressed flowers turned into wafers. These she stacked between layers of lard cloth, pressed down with an iron pan, saved for later. Later always came, and there was always less than she'd hoped. Upstairs, the nobles began to speak of spring, but not in celebration. They spoke with suspicion, as if spring had cheated them of a noble winter death, as if it had betrayed their suffering with mere survival. The Duke resumed his walks, though only in the chapel corridor. The echo of his boots returned like a ceremony. The Duchess ordered candles lit in all rooms, as if chasing away the memory of darkness. But Gertrude saw what the others missed. They were thinner now, not just in body, but in purpose. The young lord, who once laughed when he spilled his wine, now refused to eat unless his bread was cut into perfect triangles. The steward carried his tally books as if they contained confession. The priest, whose prayers once filled the chapel like incense, now whispered only the endings of psalms, skipping over the beginnings. These were people who had not built their minds for survival. They had lived through the winter, but they had not emerged from it. The kitchen changed its rhythm. No longer a place of emergency, it became something gentler. The fire no longer burned in desperation. It smoldered like an old friend resting its bones. And the steam from the pot of Reconstanel seemed to rise with grace, not effort. There was a child who came each morning, not a servant, not a noble, a foundling, half feral, who had been discovered in the woodshed during the worst of the snow. He never spoke, only nodded. Gertrude let him peel turnips quietly. He sat by the back table, a knife far too large in his small hand, scraping slow arcs down the length of the route. His slices were uneven, but he worked carefully, and that was enough. She called him Salt. No one else knew his name. No one else seemed to care. But each morning, Salt peeled turnips, and each evening he stayed just long enough to take a bowl of soup and disappear into the hallways again. Sometimes he left things behind: a feather, a button, once even a cracked egg, gifts or payment, or both. Gertrude never asked. She boiled the turnips with garlic skin, let them absorb the smoke, salted the pot twice, and served it with a crust of bread so dry it crackled like leaves when torn. It wasn't delicious, it was survival. Outside, the snow line receded. The birds returned in pairs, and then in flocks. The mice came back too, which meant the cats turned to their posts along the rafters. The kitchen regained its voice, the scurry of claws, the clatter of pots, the sizzle of rendered fat, and eventually someone brought news from the nearest village. There had been deaths, more than expected. The fields would not be planted on time. Many families had left their homes to seek warmth elsewhere, abandoning winter-stiffened cottages to the wild. The roads would be impassable for trade wagons until midsummer. Perhaps later, the castle was one of the few places that had endured intact. Gertrude stirred the stew, listened, nodded, and then added a pinch more salt, because she knew that survival in one season only bought you a seat at the next crisis. The Duke summoned her for the first time, not through the steward, not with a summons written in ink. He came himself, stood in the kitchen doorway with snow melting in lines down his sleeves. He did not speak at first, only looked at the fire, at the pot, at the boy peeling turnips, at the rack of herbs, now down to a few curled leaves. "You cooked us through the dark," he said at last. Gertrude said nothing. She kept stirring. "You cooked with ash," he added, "and we tasted warmth." She nodded once. He paused, looked at his hands, then asked, "What will you need for spring?" It was not a question she had ever been asked. What did a cook need? Not what she could salvage, not what she could beg from the cellars, but what she needed. She looked at the pot, at the spoon worn thin at the edges, at salt, cool, now peeled more evenly, and she said, softly, "A garden." The Duke blinked. "A garden," she repeated. "Not a plot, a real one, near the south wall, with the drainage. I'll need fresh soil and someone to build fencing." The Duke nodded slowly. "And seeds?" he asked. "I'll trade for those. Kai have brought the villagers would weep to taste." He stared at her, and for the first time, she saw something flicker behind his eyes. Respect, perhaps, or recognition. Then he left, without another word. By the next week, a plot had been cleared. By the next month, she had a fence. By the first heat of true spring, she had planted 3 rows, onion, chard, and radish. And though the summer would come late, it would come. And when it did, cook who salted the snow would serve soup made from fresh greens. It would not be loud. It would not be celebrated, but it would be eaten and remembered. Some years later, a visitor to the castle asked the steward how the place had survived the long winter of 3, the same winter that had starved 3 neighboring fiefs and reduced whole villages to silence. The steward, older now, with fingers too stiff to hold his tally books for long, simply nodded toward the kitchens and said, "Ask her." But Gertrude did not answer such questions. She merely ladled another bowl, watched the steam rise, and passed the spoon across the table. She had no stories to tell, only broth, which was, in the end, the only history that mattered.